thank you everyone for being here. We appreciate that. And given that we have very little time, we're going to go ahead and get started. We would like to share with you some demographics of the current status of the bilingual population as it pertains to Spanish-speaking school-age children. So here, these data just got published this month, actually. I'm very excited. I like new data. And it shows the 25, well, right here I'm not showing you the 25, I'm showing you the top 9 most commonly spoken languages by English learners. And of course, to no surprise to us, Spanish is the number 1. And then we see that there's almost 4 million speakers of Spanish who are learning English. And then the next category only has 100,000. So there is a great demand for finding the right tools and the right services, of course, for this population. Then here we see the map of the most popular language by state. And once again, Spanish keeps popping up. As a matter of fact, the U.S. is the second largest country where Spanish is spoken, and this is not even the official language of the U.S. We have 57 million people here in the U.S. who speak Spanish, and the only other country that has more is, of course, Mexico with 123 million. So let's look at some census data very quickly. We can see here that the school-age population ages 5 to 17 in 2000 was about 53 million. And by the 2011 census, it went down just a tiny bit to 52,000. But what's surprising is that if you look at the next column, the number and the percentage who speak a non-English language at home almost doubled. So it went from 18.4% in 2000 to almost 34% in 2011. And then if we look, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get some of the tools here in the presentation, right here. If you look at these very last number, this one is the most current that we have. It's about 1.5 million children who speak Spanish and English not very well. And this is reported for ages 5 to 14. So that's the entire population. Now, what if we look only at children who are enrolled in public schools K through 12? Well, then we can look at this pie chart on the left. And of all children enrolled in K through 12, we have about 5% who speak English with difficulty. But what happens when you look only at those who are Hispanic? That percentage that speak English with difficulty, it goes up to 17%. So really, it is huge. And for us who are in the mental health field, and especially those of us who are in school psychology, we get this percentage, right? This is part of the population that we work with, and we're tasked with answering the question, okay, is this child speaking English with difficulty and falling behind because there is a true underlying disorder, or is it just a language difference? Is it just that the child is going through the normal process of second language acquisition, or is there something else, right? That's the question that we have to answer. So let's see how this difference looks on the performance, the academic performance side. This graph here is from data on Hispanics. The bottom 3 bars show Hispanics who are non-English learners. And the top 3 show Hispanics who are English learners. And then here we see the performance of how well they do on a 4th grade math test. The more green that you see means the more children who are below the basic level on these tests. And the more blue that you see is the better that they do at proficient or even at an advanced level. And so 2 big points to take from this slide. One is for those who are non-English learners, there's less number who are performing below basic, right? We can see here the big discrepancy between those who are non-English learners and those who are. But the second thing is that year after year, this gap is increasing, right? We can see from 2013 to 15 to 17 that we have a higher number of Hispanic ELs, English learners, who are performing below the basic level. So we got to do something. We have to figure this out. Now let's look at, this is from a study in 2001, but they looked at 4-year-olds and their proficiency in recognizing letters on the left column and numbers and shapes on the right column. And why is this important? Because this is a predictor of reading, right? So these skills are very, very important in the future acquisition of reading skills and then academic success. So we see here that the Hispanic group is the second lowest performing group. So we can see in letter recognition only 23%, and for numbers and shapes, which we may think, well, these have less to do with language, there's still only about half of the Hispanics in this cohort who were proficient in numbers and shapes compared to 73% in the white majority. So now let's look at what we're doing from a school front perspective. We know from research by Collier and Cummins, for example, that really the best way to enhance the acquisition or to facilitate the acquisition of a second language is really by fostering the development of the first language, right? The results are worse when we just stop the development of that first language. So research has shown that really the best program for bilingual education is that which offers instructions in content areas in the native language of the student. And this survey here shows that only about 44% of schools are providing these services. So it's the most effective program, yet is the least used program. And if we look on the teacher side, the percentage of teachers who are ESL certified, here the green line shows elementary school teachers and the purple line means secondary school teachers. And we see here that it's only about 1.5% in elementary school. And while it is true that we have more non-English speakers in elementary grades than in secondary grades, we still see here a very, very small percentage of teachers who are certified and trained to teach these populations. Now, I noticed that many of you are school psychologists, so I figured this would be interesting to you. This is from a 2015 survey, and it shows that the percentage of school psychologists in the U.S. who are fluent in different languages, it shows that 86% are fluent in English only. And then only 7% consider themselves to be fluent enough in Spanish to provide services in Spanish. So just for fun, I went to the NASP directory, and since my co-presenter, Dr. Puente, is in North Carolina, I said, let me see how many bilingual Spanish-speaking school psychologists there are in North Carolina. And I found 8. Not 8%, but just the number 8. And he informed me that there's about 740 school psychologists in the state. Then I went and looked at Texas, because I'm in Texas, and you know, everything is bigger in Texas. So here I found 69 Spanish-speaking school psychologists registered with the NASP directory. But the thing is, in Texas we have about 3,000 school psychologists. So you see here this proportion is very, very small. And of those 69 that I found, one of them is myself. And I'm not even practicing. I do some volunteering in the schools, but I'm not even a practicing school psychologist. So we can see really that there is a need for not just the trained and competent practitioners, right, at the school psychology and at the teaching level, but also in terms of the tools, right? We don't necessarily have all the tools that we need. The children are there, the population is there, but we don't necessarily have the tools that we need. And Dr. Puente is going to talk about that next.
We have several challenges before us regarding both developing and actually using these tests. So the next few slides, I'm going to share with you some of the challenges that I've experienced in doing this work over a number of years, primarily as a neuropsychologist interested in cultural aspects. As a Spanish speaker, native Spanish speaker, I've been fascinated with trying to figure out how is it that we measure both intellectual and neurocognitive abilities with tests that in many ways are just not there. So let's take a look at the standards for educational psychological tests that were published in 2014. The standards, as you may recall, are published approximately every 15 years, and I was one of roughly about 13 of us that met over a period of 5 years to come up with the standards. I was particularly interested in realizing that the two core chapters of those standards were reliability and validity. And at the end, if you will, as an appendage to the core material, were chapters on how to deal with, if you will, diverse populations. One of the fascinating things that we did is took that concept and enveloped it in the following way. We made fairness a core value in the development, use, and interpretation of educational psychological tests. And working in Chapter 3, which is the fairness chapter, along with validity and reliability, there is a quote that I want to begin my section as a foundation for understanding this particular challenge before us. A test that is fair does not unduly advantage or, for that matter, disadvantage certain examinees because individual characteristics that are relevant to the construct being measured. Throughout that chapter, the phrase construct irrelevance was brought over and over again to emphasize that we have to be clear what is the construct that we're trying to measure and what is the error that comes from not measuring it correctly. So to go into slightly more detail on Chapter 3, all steps in the testing process, including the design, validation, development, administration, scoring procedures, should be designed in such a manner as to minimize construct irrelevant variance. Construct irrelevant variance, and to promote valid score interpretations for the intended uses of all examinees in the intended population. In addition, and this is critical, there are 4 clusters that go with the basically what we just discussed in Standard 3.0. And there are as follows: that the test design, development, administration, and scoring procedures, and I should add the use, minimize barriers to valid score interpretations for the widest possible range of individuals and relevant subgroups. Number 2, the validity of test scores interpretations for the intended use for the intended examinee population. And I'll use an example in just a few moments to illustrate this particular point as well as the others. 3, accommodations to remove construct irrelevant barriers and support valid interpretation of scores for their intended uses, and safeguards for inappropriate score interpretation for intended uses. Let me give you the example that I shared with you. When I came over from Cuba as a young person at the age of 9, the question became, where do we put this child in the school system? And my mom said they were going to be giving you tests. I explained to her I did not know English, and she just said, "Son, smile and be friendly." I wonder what my diagnosis was, and why is it that I was not given opportunity that I thought should be afforded because of my unique interest in learning the language, the culture, and the material that was ahead of me. Basically, I was labeled incorrectly because of what I think is construct irrelevant barrier. Instead of measuring intelligence or academic ability, in my case, they measured language proficiency. The two were confounded. My son, who is also a neuropsychologist, says to me, Papa, I think when it's all said and done, we don't do research, we actually do me-search. And because that particular illustration provides a backdrop, let me share with you how this journey has come to be and basically give you some ideas of the challenges before us. I started back in the early 1990s trying to translate the Lurie, Nebraska neuropsychological battery to try and make some sense of how we could measure neuropsychological function and dysfunction in individuals that did not have access to the English language. I must tell you that there's all kinds of difficulties, ranging from copyright to simply just translating ideas and words literally, and I might add, incorrectly. Approximately 1988, 1899 or so, I connected with Gail Royd at then Psychological Corporation, subsequently Pearson, saying we really could use some Western material in Spanish. And since then, I've been very fortunate to have been working with a wonderful group, including Maria Munoz, among others, to try and develop products that allow us to measure some basic things, critical things, such as intelligence and Spanish speakers. And more recently, I've gotten involved with the translation and standardization of the new MMPI. And over the last 3 years, we've embarked a very ambitious project supported by the European Union in order to bring a neuropsychological test that would be based on a platform that was accessible on iPads and available free of charge to anyone that wanted to use. We're in the middle of doing that. We have approximately 400 volunteers in our initial pool. We look forward to having something in the future. We worked in the U.S., especially Puerto Rico and Florida, and subsequently we've expanded our boundaries to Latin America and Russia, and more recently Europe and the Middle East, in search of trying to figure out how is it that culture plays a role in how we measure brain function. And all those years and those several publications, which, by the way, you can find at antonioepuente.com, I will share with you some observations that may be of value as we move forward in trying to rectify the difficulties before us in measuring intellectual and related functions in Spanish speakers. First of all, how do we translate all of this into equity? Think of the concept of validity and reliability as core, and let's add to that fairness. And let's go one step further. Let's translate fairness into applied validity. We all know what validity is from the standpoint of psychometrics, but in this case, it's the application to real-world issues when we're dealing with a diverse population. And let's define fairness as limiting construct irrelevance. In other words, let's make sure that we don't measure noise, and if we do so, that we have a clear understanding what is noise and what is construct. So some of the challenges that come before me and have been there since my original work with my mentor Roger Sperry, who discovered the left brain and right brain, the question, what is G? What is universal? This comes from Raymond Cattell, the concept of general intelligence. Is there something that is so genetic and hardwired? And Sperry told me back in 1994, before he died, that yes, indeed, he thought that most of it was hardwired. And indeed, theoretically, universal, that it goes across all languages, all socioeconomic status, and essentially universal. But, what is culture? What is indigenous? And what is open to educational efforts? Because after all, the bottom line is doing something with what we have and making everybody have equal opportunity to learn and to move forward. So the question is culture what the brain learns to adapt to? And when he suggested that 95% was indeed genetic and hardwired, the remaining 5 was left for question. And I asked him one late afternoon, in his backyard, "Roger, what do you think about the 5? He said, "That's more important than the 95. However, there are some theoretical issues that I want to share with you. We want to make sure that we don't confound cultural knowledge with cognitive abilities. Just because I did not know English did not indicate that I could not learn. The two are two different things. Sometimes, when we confound those two, measurement error becomes data. And we confuse the two, and if we repeat it over and over again, indeed, Antonio Puente is really not that smart, because every test that we give him, he simply doesn't seem to score at the norms. One of the challenges before us is, how do we translate and how do we adapt? When I did the Lurie, Nebraska back in the 1980s, I translated word for word what I saw on each of the items. And sometimes when I did so, the items just did not make sense. There's a concept that's more challenging, more difficult, and more appropriate. And that is, we don't translate items. We don't translate concepts. We adapt items. We make things be valuable and correct. For example, in neuropsychology, we often use the letters F, A, and S to determine verbal fluency. How many words can you come up with in 60 seconds? However, it turns out that F, A, and S do not find themselves in equal levels of use in the Spanish language. Or let's take even something simple like 8, single syllable word, whereas ocho is 2 syllables. That turns out to be a bigger challenge for someone who has, for example, aphasia. Now, let's talk about the practical issues, because this is not just all about theory. Sometimes it's just about how to make it happen. Let's talk about obtaining tests. Sometimes the tests are just simply almost impossible to get. You have to purchase them, for example, from Spain or from Mexico, or if you're lucky, from the U.S., but not all publishers make them readily available and easy to find in their catalogs. So sometimes it's just downright difficult. The first time that I bought a Wechsler scale, I did so through a third party in Mexico, because I couldn't, in the early days, do through our test publishers in the U.S. Then there is the issue of copyright. Sometimes, because we just don't have the cash available to us in our school districts or in our offices, we get one test or we get the sample test, and we just simply copy it over and over again. There's a reason for the copyright. It's not to prevent us from doing the work. It's just to make sure that the authors and the publishers get funded appropriately, so the research is important. One of the things that I discovered in doing the translation and adaptation of some of the earlier Wechsler scales, the costs associated with even the simple drawings, the black and white drawings, were basically mind-blowing. It was unbelievable. It cost a huge amount of money to do these tests. And, of course, the issue of accommodation and modification, which is well outlined in the Standards for Educational and Psychological Tests. Accommodation means that you don't change the construct when you translate the test, or, if you will, adapt it. So you're just basically making sure that the intended idea that you're trying to measure has not changed just because you've changed the language or whatever other method. If you do so, then you end up modifying the test. It turns out that sometimes we have translations, even in Spanish, of some psychological tests that when you get down to business, the test has not been accommodated for each of these linguistic minorities, but the test has actually been modified. So it doesn't matter that the tests look and sound alike. They're actually different tests altogether. We have to be careful. Accommodation doesn't change the construct. Modification does. When we started doing the fairness chapter of the standards, in the earlier version of the standards, the emphasis was on linguistic variables. I am here to share with you this afternoon that linguistic variables are critical and important, but in my humble opinion, cultural are much more complicated and much more important. So let's not forget that just getting a child or a client, or as APA has recently stated, patient, just because they understand the words doesn't necessarily mean that the culture is the same. The word taco in different Spanish subcultures means quite different things. In the case of, for example, a bus, it could be a bus, or a guagua, or a camello, or a micro. There are different ways in different cultures to express the same thing. And then, of course, there are the issue of norms. For those of us who have been involved in the standardization of the Wechsler scales, among others, it is unbelievably difficult to find the right child, the right person, the right location, with the right demographics. It is so difficult. And sometimes, having done this myself, our norms are really samples of convenience, and very often incomplete and incorrect. And sometimes, as found in the chapter that we published in Kurt Geisinger's book, Psychological Evaluation of Hispanics, sometimes the norms are just simply not there. In the so-called 500 tests that are available for Spanish speakers in the literature, less than maybe 25 have really strong norms. And then, of course, the applications. Just because the test is available doesn't necessarily mean we should use it. It depends. It depends what you want to use the test for. So, for example, if we're measuring a child's intellectual ability, that may be quite different than what grade placement should that child be in. Two different questions. Same child, possibly same test. The result, quite different. Be careful. Be thoughtful. What is it that you're trying to use the test for? So how do we resolve this unusual situation that we find ourselves? Few tests, limited norms, and as Maria said earlier, very few Spanish-speaking school psychologists, at least in North Carolina as well as in Texas. So, suggestion. My own, something for you to consider. Begin with when tests are available, hopefully in Spanish, hopefully with norms, hopefully with a good way of trying to get them to understand the construct and for you to get good data. However, let's understand the child. Let's contextualize the child inside a social historical frame. Otherwise, what we may be doing, as we said earlier, is confusing, confounding error of measurement with the construct that's intended to be measured. So Maria is going to try and give us some potential solutions. Maria?
Thank you, Dr. Puente. Fascinating viewpoints that you've shared with us. Thank you very much. So let's talk about some potential solutions, and they're potential solutions. They're not the solution, and we're aware that there are other solutions that we're not presenting here, not on purpose, but simply for time convenience. So we are aware these are not the only ones. We're just going to review a few of them. So we have Ochoa and Ortiz's MAMBI model. The MAMBI stands for Multidimensional Assessment Model for Bilingual Individuals. And they propose that we look at 3 different variables. The child's language profile, their CALT levels, where are they in that language development? Their current grade and their instructional history. So what kind of bilingual program have they been in and for how long, if they've been in a bilingual program at all. And then combining these 3 variables, they provide, Ochoa and Ortiz, they provide a very nice matrix suggesting how the child might be tested, right? Perhaps in L1 only, which in our case would be Spanish, perhaps L2 only, which would be English, bilingually in both, and of course there is a bilingual assessment and an assessment of bilingual abilities, and non-verbally. So that's one option. Another model is what's called the model by Olvera and Gomez Cerrillo, and they propose that we look at multiple sources of information, that of course we conduct observations, we make data-driven hypotheses, also look at the English language development of the individual, and then determine the language of assessment. Of course, we have formal and informal measures. We have acculturation questionnaires, we have linguistic questionnaires, we have language proficiency, we have conceptual scoring, which is something relatively new. So we have different ways and methods of evaluating these children. In the end, it comes down to, like Dr. Puente said, contextualizing the child, right? It's not just about the educational and the cognition. It's also about the socioeconomic and linguistic and cultural background of the child. There's also a school of thought that suggests that for cognitive abilities, we should be testing those in the native language, whereas for academic abilities, achievement, we should be testing those in the language of instruction. So regardless of what's your preference or what your district suggests that you do, I have volunteered at some districts that they tell me if the child is bilingual, you have to test in both languages. But let's say that you did your homework and you have decided that you're going to test a child in Spanish for cognitive abilities. So one option that you have, once again, it's just one of the options, is the WISC V Spanish. So we're going to very briefly cover the sample, the norms, and then a little extra qualitative step that we did, which is the adjusted scores. But first things first, credit where credit is due. So we want to express our gratitude to our examiners who help us collect these hard-to-find data. I'm sure many of those who are in the call today participated in the data collection. Thank you very much. You made this possible. Also, thank you to the families, those children and those parents who answered all the questions, who sat through hours of testing and were driving around to make it possible. And of course, our advisory panel who has been alongside us, guiding these from conceptualization to final product, and even now, like Dr. Puente himself, who is supporting this webinar. So we have Dr. Antolín Lorente, and Dr. Antonio Puente, Dr. Christine Salinas, Dr. Marlene Sotelo Dinega, and Dr. Monica Ogañez. Now that I see Dr. Sotelo Dinega's name there, I notice there is a question in the chat about, using this test, which is only in Spanish, and what happens if you do not speak Spanish. So Dr. Sotelo Dinega has published some papers on the non-discriminatory assessment of the bilingual assessment by the non-bilingual professional. So that's some reading that might be helpful to answer that question. So when we sat down to talk about the WISC V Spanish, of course we knew that it had to be a test that accounted for all the linguistic variations that we see here in the U.S. because the test is developed for those children ages 6 through 16 who speak Spanish as their primary language, who speak and understand Spanish better than English, and who reside in the U.S., and this includes Puerto Rico. So we have about 21 different Spanish-speaking countries represented here in the U.S. And we knew that it wasn't practical to have 21 different Spanish versions, but that it also wasn't practical to have 21 different norms, right? Because all of these children are here in the U.S., and they're being held to the same standards as their U.S. English-speaking peers. So the first thing that we did was, okay, let's look at the country of origin. And we looked at the census, and based in part on Dr. Puente's recommendation, we undersampled the Mexican sample, because otherwise we would have ended up with a sample which was mostly Mexican. And we wanted to give some room to all the other countries so that we could get more samples from children who spoke a different linguistic variation and had also different cultural experiences. So you can see here the bars on the left represent the census, and the bars on the right represent the percentage that we had in the sample. And there was a variable, though, that we did not want to undersample or oversample. We wanted to stay very, very close to the census. And that's parent education level, which, as you may know, it is used as a proxy for SES. And we know from research that SES accounts for about 16% of the variance in SSIQ scores. So this variable here, we went very close to the census. And then we said, okay, our norms have to mean the same, right? Whether you give the test in English or you give the test in Spanish, because the test is developed to be used in Spanish in the U.S., and once again, those children are being held to the same standards, we need to make sure that the norms are equated to one another. So here's an example. I'm sure you've heard of the Big Mac Index, which is used in business, and it's something like how many burgers can you get for $50 in different countries. So I tried to do something like that here. But this is not just the burger, this is a whole combo meal. The burger, the fries, and the soda. Here in the U.S., the average price is about $7 for this meal. In Peru, which is the red here, is $4.56. And in Argentina, it's about $5.51. But let's say that an individual from Peru comes here to the U.S. and goes to McDonald's to buy the meal. So a McDonald's employee is not going to say, well, because you're from Peru, only pay me $4.56. The person from Peru is still going to have to pay the $7, right? And they're still getting the same product. Of course, we could argue that, you know, the quality of the meat is different, of the flavor of the cheese is different. Yes. But in the end, it's the same product. They're in the same country, the same, you know, if we go to Argentina, we're not going to pay $7, we're going to pay $5.21. So that's exactly what we wanted to do with the norms. Now, very important here, this does not mean that the norms are harder for those individuals who come from other countries. It simply means that they are equivalent to one another, that we put them exactly on the same plane. Think about it as two different forms of the same test. There are some tests that have Form A and Form B, but you know that it doesn't matter which one you give, the results are going to mean the same. So that's what the WISC V Spanish did. Now, did we have to equate all of the subtests? No. We only had to equate those that had more of a change. So for example, think of matrix reasoning. Well, matrix reasoning, the only difference there was the language in which the instructions were given. But the items were the same, the item order was the same, the response that's elicited from the child was the same. So those used the U.S. norms straight from the WISC V English. These subtests that you see here, those were the ones that were equated. And of course, we didn't just equate it and ran with it. We actually verified that the equating scores were coming out as theory and science would tell us that they should. So on top of the equation, we verified the accuracy of the scores by looking at construct validity and sensitivity specificity for a sample of children with intellectual disability and in the high range of performance, which is HCA here, which means high cognitive ability. Then we also did a random match control study between WISC V Spanish and WISC V English to make sure that the scores were coming out the same and that they were not different based on age, gender, or SES, for example. And then, of course, we looked at the consistency with our prior edition, the WISC V Spanish. So that was one thing that we did, the equating of the subtext. And then we went a step further, and we provided adjusted scores. Now, let me just stop here for a very brief minute and let you know that these adjusted scores cannot be used to replace the normative score that you get from the norms, right, from the equating norms that you get. These adjusted scores are to be used only qualitatively. And what we adjust here is the verbal subtext. Why? Well, we were doing some research for the French-Canadian WISC, and we noticed that there were some linguistic and environment-mediated variables that had an effect on the performance of the verbal subtext. So we looked at a similar thing here for our sample in the U.S. We looked at variables that you can see in this questionnaire that have to do with the language environment of the child. So some of the questions, for example, are the number of years that the child has attended school inside the U.S. versus outside, with the language of the person who was the primary caregiver of the child during the early years. And then these variables actually turn to be significant predictors of scores in the verbal subtests. So this questionnaire is available on both Q Interactive and the paper manual, and you're free to print these and distribute among your parents. What you cannot do, though, is change the way the questions were asked, because those questions then translate into these predictors that I was talking about that have a significant effect in the performance on these subtests, the verbal subtests. So I know I'm running short of time, but I think we're going to be just fine here. The way we plug in these numbers, the answers to the questions on that questionnaire, to then derive an adjusted score is through a series of rather complex regression equations. So because of these, we cannot do these by hand. We can only obtain those by going through the Q Interactive or the Q Global platforms and then generating these adjusted scores. So once again, these are not normative data. They do not represent intellectual ability. They are provided by the parent, so there may be some subjectivity there. And they have not been validated for special education eligibility. We're actually hoping that there's research that comes out of the field that can help guide this part. And then, of course, like everything else we do, we never interpret anything in isolation. So how can you use these adjusted scores? Well, perhaps you hypothesize that a child's developmental experiences or other environmental factors impacted the estimate of his or her true abilities, right? You might think that the child has a limited level of acculturation to the U.S. Perhaps the kid lives in a self-contained Spanish-speaking community, and that's related to the level of acculturation or of linguistic acquisition. And so that's when you want to look at these adjusted scores. And then on page 183 of the manual, we give you different scenarios that compare the adjusted scores to the normative scores and give you samples of interpretive statements that you can use. So in this case, for example, you could say the child appears to be performing verbal comprehension tasks in Spanish better than what might be expected given the amount of support that the child gets in his or her environment for the development of the Spanish language. And with that, we're going to move on to some questions and answers.
Okay, Maria, are you going to go ahead and go through some of the questions?
Yes. So, okay, there is a question about, yes, that with so few bilingual school psychologists who speak Spanish, then how can they use the test? And can it be put on a WISC V, on a CD? So that research that Dr. Sotelo Dinega has done that provides some ideas into how can a non-bilingual speaker assess in a non-discriminatory manner the bilingual speaker. Then Dr. Puente, I think this one it might be for you. Can you define construct irrelevant variance?
Essentially, is that we are measuring error. So in the case of the example that I used, measuring language proficiency should not be construed as measuring intelligence. Let's make clear that we know what is it that we're trying to measure, and let's try and do our very best to see if there are any errors that could be coming into the evaluation that don't have to do with intelligence. And the simple example has to do with we are measuring language, not intelligence.
Thank you, Dr. Puente. Okay, let me look at the next
As she's looking for another question, let me add the following. The number of questions that come in from the several hundred participants is really overwhelming. We'll do our best to answer a representative sample, and we look forward to going back and through each of these questions and posting your responses as best as possible. We appreciate your enthusiasm. We just don't have the time to be able to address all of them. For example, somebody says, please compare the WISC V with other Spanish tests. Let me alert you to a chapter from the Geisinger book on psychological assessment of Spanish speakers that compares different kinds of psychological and neuropsychological tests for Spanish speakers. There's a list in there that you might be able to find, or you could find the PDF version of that chapter in antonioepuente.com. Let me turn it over back to you, Maria.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Puente. I see another question. I did not see Puerto Rico in the flag. Were they included? Yes, they were. So they were part of our Caribbean sample, and we made sure that we included children from Puerto Rico who were residing in the island, as well as children from Puerto Rico who were in the continental U.S. So we had representation from both Puerto Rican populations or groups, so to speak. Is there a
Maria,
way...
let me ask this question for several of the folks that are asking. I am English speaker. I live in a situation where there are no Spanish psychologists or school psychologists for several counties around us. What am I to do when I'm given the challenge of trying to assess a child not only whose native language is Spanish, but does not have an adequate proficiency in English to measure anything of value under the circumstances? Maria, what are we to do?
Yes, it's a very common question, and one for which the ideal answer does not exist. And as we saw in one of the slides, there are other languages that are coming more and more, right? So even if we are prepared to assess them in Spanish, chances are that we're also going to get some that are not even Spanish, and we don't have any tools for those. So yes, in many cases, I have recommended nonverbal. The training of a good interpreter in some cases is acceptable as well. So like I said, those are not ideal, but when it comes to that, where there's no one for miles and miles, and we have to provide something for the child, right? We have to provide accommodations or modifications or a resolution. So those are our options. Dr. Puente, do you have other ideas or want to complement my response?
Well, our goal is really for the short term to see what we do with this particular circumstance at this particular time. And the ones that you have suggested are outstanding ideas. Keep in mind, however, that even if you do nonverbal, appreciate the fact that if you look at the work of folks like Alfredo Ardila and Monica Roselli in South Florida, we have discovered that nonverbal still is not non-cultural. So we have to be
Absolutely.
careful as we move forward to make sure that there is probably fair to say no true culturally fair test. So, for example, use the translator as best as you can. Avoid the family because they may just be complicating the picture. And above all, if this is all you've got, do your very best and qualify as much as possible the limitations that you have found yourself in, and warn others that this may only be a small window of a complex question.
Absolutely. And yes, there is no culture-free, language-free tests, right? They're culturally reduced or language reduced, but you're absolutely right. Being nonverbal does not mean it's not cultural. And that's where the professional judgment of us as practitioners come into play. Okay. Another question, is there a WISC Spanish? There are several versions of the WISC in Spanish in different countries. We don't have one that has been developed and normed in the U.S. Spanish-speaking population. Dr. Puente, I know you've done a lot of research on different versions of Spanish WISCs.
My primary research has been with WISC 3, and we know that there are tests available from Spain, from Puerto Rico, and from Mexico, but it turns out that there are also versions from other countries like Chile and Argentina. Now, here's the issue, okay? I can get a hold of these, and by the way, it's difficult to do so, but let's say I do, because after all, I have an Argentinian child. But go back to the question that we raised earlier. What's the purpose of the evaluation? If you're trying to measure an Argentinian's intellectual ability, maybe the Argentinian version of the WISC might be appropriate. But if the question is what grade level, maybe a different one would be appropriate. So always remind yourself what is the intention of the evaluation and what's the outcome, intended and unintended, of what we do.
Mm-hmm. That's correct. I think we have time for one more question, and were the item responses based more on the Mexican population due to the percentages shown? So first, we undersampled the Mexican population to have more sample responses from the other ones. But the sample responses are not exclusively based on a Mexican dialect, so to speak. So we had an advisory panel that you saw earlier, and they provided background from different countries other than Mexico. We also had surveys going out to examiners and practitioners in different countries that did not include Mexico to make sure that we didn't misscore any responses that we encountered that were a correct response in some other country and we just didn't know of that, or that it wasn't a correct response in Mexico. I'm particularly married to a person from Guatemala, and I remember early on in our marriage we would fight over the correct word for the word bus, which Dr. Puente mentioned, and I said it's camión, and he said no, it's bus. I said it's not bus. Bus is just misreading the bus word in English, so you're just misreading it. And then his grandma said, no, mijita, it is bus. So, because that's how it is in Guatemala. So, you know, we have learned the lesson. We, as in those of us who work here and develop these tests, we have learned the lesson that Spanish has many variations and that there isn't one that's correct, right? So we're very mindful of that. We take into account feedback from others. We also, some of you who were examiners sent us your feedback. So no, it's not an entirely Mexican sample responses that you'll see there. But also important to say is that if the child spontaneously responds in English, you can give credit for that response. So the child is free to respond in English or Spanish, and as long as the response is correct, they will receive credit for that. And I think we're right on time. So Dr. Puente, anything else?
Well, to add that real quickly to your comments, I think in the future we'll do as best as we can to develop tests that are in PAN Spanish, P-A-N Spanish, although that's very, very difficult. But we're clearly knowledgeable that this is an issue. We look forward to continuing our fight forward. We appreciate everybody's concern, involvement, and questions, and we look forward to doing another of these webinars. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.